closed. Yay! Pre-chapter questions. Let's see what you picked up as you looked at the chat. All right. So we've got 3 questions. Okay. Question 1. What are the 2 systems that make up aerobic metabolism? So when we look at the umbrella of aerobic metabolism, it's split into 2 subsections. What are the 2 sections? We have 2 systems that work together to make aerobic metabolism. What are those 2 systems? Question number 2. Which source provides most energy at rest? Carbohydrate or fat? Which source provides the most energy at rest? Carbohydrate or fat? Question number 3. What does BMR stand for? BMR. BMR. Alright, so question number 1. What are the 2 systems that work together to make aerobic metabolism? Which source provides most energy at rest, carbohydrate or fat? What does BMR stand for? Okay, swap off. All right. So, 1 point for each question, total out of 3. Alright? Make sure that the person has their name on the piece of paper. Okay, 2 systems under aerobic metabolism, Krebs. So you could have Krebs, you could have Krebs cycle. Okay? And the second one is the electron transport chain. So you could have ETC, electron transport system. Some books call it an ETS, our book says ETC. Right? So those are our 2. So if they got both of them, that's 1 point. If they got one of them, that's half a point. Which source provides most energy at rest? Fat. And what does BMR stand for? Basal metabolic rate. Okay, so give them a total out of 3. And, yes.
Well, basal or rest metabolism.
Okay, Darren will pick those up as we go through. So let's have a look. All right, remember at the end of chapter 2, we had finished up glycolysis, broken down a carbohydrate, and at the bottom of glycolysis, we end up with a molecule called pyruvate. How many pyruvates do I have for each molecule of glucose? 2. All right. So we mentioned that what happens to that pyruvate depends on whether or not there's enough oxygen available in the cell. Okay, so if we're working anaerobically, that means that we haven't had time to get enough oxygen into the muscle cell, all right? Then the pyruvate is going to turn into lactate, lactic acid, and then we get into lactate. All right, and that lactate is going to get shuffled off into the bloodstream. If, however, you've been working for a long enough period of time that your body has had chance to get oxygen via the lungs into the bloodstream, carried around and dumped off at the muscle tissue, then pyruvate, instead of turning into lactate, gets shuttled off somewhere else into the cell, and it goes to the mitochondria, and it gets fed into aerobic metabolism. All right, so that's why carbohydrate is an important fuel for exercise, because I can use it anaerobically and I can use it aerobically. Right? Just depends on how much oxygen there is available in the cell as to what is going on. Alright, so remember to have a look at those objectives when you're going through your chapter. You should at least recognize what the objectives are talking about. Okay. So, system 1, first 30 seconds, emphasizes the ATP-PC system. That's going to be the predominant system providing energy for the first 30 seconds. Okay. Between 30 seconds and 2.5 to 3 minutes, so by 2.5 you've got quite a bit of aerobic work starting. By 3 it's predominantly aerobic. Right? So glycolysis is going to pick up and be the predominant source of energy from around half a minute to 2.5 to 3 minutes. Okay, so here's our lactate, and then if we've got oxygen available, then we're going to shuttle the pyruvate off to the mitochondria. Right? So aerobic metabolism is predominant during extended long duration, relatively low intensity, so either at rest or low to moderate. Once we start getting to those higher intensities, we're really working anaerobically because it takes too long to get oxygen to the muscle cell. Right? So at rest and long duration gives me the opportunity for high energy production with very low waste products. Any limiting byproducts are minimal when we're looking at aerobic metabolism. So, if I'm working aerobically, then I can use my carbohydrate via glycolysis. I can break down stored fat. So my triglyceride that's in my fat cell, we can break that down by a process called beta oxidation. And I generally don't cover beta oxidation with an undergrad class because beta oxidation doesn't directly produce ATP. Unlike carbohydrate breakdown, where we actually get a little bit of ATP directly from breaking down the carbohydrate. When we break down fat, we don't get any ATP until the products have already got over into their system 3. All right, so Aerobic metabolism then takes place in the mitochondria. So if you remember back to your biology, mitochondria is the cell that has all those squiggly folds in it. Sometimes it's called the battery or the center for high energy, right? Because it's where the majority of ATP is made. System 1 and System 2, that anaerobic metabolism, goes on in the sarcoplasm of the cell. Systems 3, Krebs and ATC, occur in the mitochondria. So we break down carbohydrate, we break down fat. They both end up at the end but in a molecule called acetyl-CoA. And once they're in that form, then they can enter Krebs cycle, and we give off hydrogens that go off to the electron transport chain. Right? So the molecule that we're looking for, the kind of mediator that we get from all our substrates, is acetyl-CoA. Alright, so our benefits of aerobic metabolism, right? We don't get lots of acid buildup when we work aerobically. As you're going to see, those hydrogen ions that are acidic get taken over to the electron transport chain, and they're used to make ATP, and then we get rid of them via water molecules. So we don't change the pH in the same way that we do when we're working anaerobically. So those enzymes that don't like the acid environment, they don't care, right? If there's water, water's neutral. So we don't have a slowdown in how the enzymes can work. We get much more efficient, much larger amounts of ATP when we work aerobically. The problem is it takes longer to get there, right? So it's more effective once we're there, just takes a little while to get going. We can use fat as well as carbohydrates, so we have another source of energy stored in our bodies that we can utilize when we're working aerobically. And fat is a great source of energy, tons of calories, right? 3,500 calories a pound. So loads and loads of calories available to us that we can access if we're working aerobically. And if we absolutely have to, we can access protein stored in the muscles. Right? We don't like to do that though. So usually, under typical circumstances, we're not going to use protein. The waste products of aerobic work are water and carbon dioxide. Both of those are very easily expelled from the body. So we don't have a big build-up of waste products. They don't cause any kinds of problems within the cell. Right? So when we're at rest, when you're sitting here, long duration, right? You've got to put up with me for another 35 minutes yet. Okay? So long duration, low intensity, you're not doing very much. You're using enough energy to stay warm. You're using enough energy to maintain posture, breathe, keep your heart rate going, but nowhere near the levels of energy that you would need to go and run or use your bike. So this is aerobic, just doesn't use very much energy to do. Walking, aerobic. Riding our bike, aerobic. Swimming, aerobic. Okay? Anything where I'm going for longer than 2.5 to 3 minutes without stopping. Okay. Alright, so first stop is Krebs cycle. So we turn pyruvate into acetyl-CoA when it gets to the mitochondria, and we end up with acetyl-CoA if we break down triglyceride, all right? And the acetyl-CoA then feeds into Krebs cycle. And this is the same, my view of this is the same as it was with glycolysis, all right? For us, right now, we have to understand why and when you're going to use this kind of system, because it impacts how you're going to train someone, right? I don't want you to spend time learning every single molecule at every step of the breakdown all the way around Krebs cycle. You got a textbook, you can look it up, you won't remember it anyway, so let's use our time more productively. All right? So acetyl-CoA feeds into Krebs cycle. Krebs cycle oxidizes the acetyl-CoA. So we get one ATP given off, okay, about halfway through the cycle, for one acetyl-CoA. Now, remember I said that the number of carbons was going to come back and play a role, right? Glucose, glycogen are 6 carbon molecules. We get 2 pieces of pyruvate, 2 3 carbon molecules of pyruvate. And pyruvate breaks down into acetyl-CoA, which is actually a 2 carbon molecule. So for every 2 carbon acetyl-CoA, we get 1 ATP. Well, then out of my carbohydrate, I only got 2 pyruvates, which means I only get 2 acetyl-CoAs. I only get 2 more additional ATPs. But when we looked at that fat molecule, remember that fat molecule had like 18 carbons in it. So when I break fat down into acetyl-CoA, I get many, many more molecules of acetyl-CoA. And so I still only get 1 ATP per acetyl-CoA, but I have more acetyl-CoA in the first place. Still, 1 ATP is not very much, right? It wouldn't even get you to stand up out of your chair. So this is not a lot of ATP yet. We are not producing enough ATP to walk out to the car or walk over the bridge and go get lunch at the Cub. So we've got to have another option for making ATP. The other important part to pay attention to on Krebs cycle is that we produce some hydrogen at different places within the cycle. And the hydrogen gets picked up by NAD, same as it did in glycolysis. Right? So we have our little NAD bus. And we have another bus that helps out the Krebs cycle, FAD. So now we have NAD and FAD, and they collect the hydrogen and take it off to the electron transport chain. So part 2 of aerobic metabolism, bearing in mind right now we've got next to no ATP. We only got a couple from glycolysis. We've only got 1 or 2 coming, 1 here per acetyl-CoA molecule. So we're really kind of stuffed for energy so far. So where's all this energy for running a marathon coming from? Right? It all comes from the electron transport chain. That's where the majority of ATP can be produced. And the textbook gets very technical looking at Krebs cycle and electron transport chain. If you're big on chemistry and you really love chemistry, by all means dive on in there. But it's pretty ugly if you don't like chemistry. All right? Don't worry too much about it. If it's not going to help you, don't bother looking at it. What you've got to understand is that the electron transport chain is the major place for making ATP. All right? Not in our textbook, but often in textbooks, the electron transport chain is depicted as a waterfall. Right? And we drop off a hydrogen, and technically that's the first incorrect thing, right? Because technically you've got hydrogens and electrons working through the chain, but this isn't a chemistry class, right? So we're going to stick with, we're dropping off hydrogen, the hydrogen works its way through the chain, and as it goes through the chain, lots and lots of ATP come off. Okay? A lot of ATP is produced while the hydrogens and electrons go through the chain. If you read it reasonably lightly, you'll notice that NAD drops its hydrogen at the top of the waterfall. FAD drops its hydrogen a little bit lower down. Right, the bus ran out of petrol. Can't make it to the top of the waterfall. So when you look at how many ATPs we get, there are always slightly different numbers, and it's a bit of an estimate because it depends whether the hydrogen got picked up by NAD or FAD. Okay. Doesn't matter. We get way more here than we get anywhere else up to this point. Okay. So, comes all the way down to the bottom of the chain. And now we have hydrogen, which we don't like because it's acidic. Okay. So far we haven't mentioned the oxygen that we said we had to have in the cell in order for aerobic metabolism to occur. Okay. And this is where the oxygen turns up, because you've been breathing a little more heavily. We shifted oxygen out of the lungs into the bloodstream. We've carried it along the bloodstream to a muscle that is exercising, and the oxygen gets dumped off into that muscle. And then the oxygen picks up a couple of hydrogens, and we end up with water, which is not acidic and easy to get rid of. Okay? If I don't have oxygen available, this can't work, because I just build up an acidic environment again. So the only way to make the large amounts of ATP is to have enough oxygen piling into the cell that it can pick up all these hydrogens and turn them into water. Does that make sense? Do it again. Want it again? Okay. All right, so let's say carbohydrate. It could be a fat, right? If it's carbohydrate, I finish with pyruvate at the end of glycolysis. I'm going to carry it over into the mitochondria, and I'm going to turn it into acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA gets fed into Krebs cycle. We get 1 ATP, not a lot of help, but we get a lot of hydrogen. The hydrogen gets picked up by either NAD or FAD, and if you consider them like a little bus system, they pick up the hydrogen and they shuttle it across to the edge of the mitochondria, and they drop it off at the electron transport chain. Once they've dropped it off, hydrogen and electrons move through the pathway of the chain, and along the way we get lots of ATP made, a lot of ATP. When we get to the bottom of the pathway though, now we've got hydrogen again, which is a problem because it's acidic, and that was the whole problem with anaerobic metabolism. So I have to have a way of getting rid of the hydrogen, and that's where our oxygen comes in. The reason it's aerobic metabolism is because I am using oxygen to make ATP. The oxygen isn't directly making the ATP. The oxygen picks up the hydrogen, turns it into water, so that the electron transport chain can continue to work and make lots of ATP. So getting oxygen into the cell becomes crucial. If I want to continue aerobic work, I have to be able to move oxygen into the muscle cell. And the next couple of chapters are looking at how do we do that. How do we get the oxygen there? Because clearly when I breathe, it doesn't turn up in my muscle. Right? I have to get it to the muscle. But once it's there, it allows me to keep making ATP, and I can keep moving for a long time. So if I go for a hike and I've got a picnic with me, we can hike for 4 or 5 hours. Right? Might be tired at the end of it, but I don't fall down flat on my face, unable to move. I can still make enough energy for muscle contraction to keep walking. Okay? So this can work for hours and hours and hours and hours. Right? When you go to bed at night, you don't stop breathing halfway through the night, hopefully, right? Because your respiratory muscles are able to keep making ATP because they've got oxygen available. Right? Long duration, low to relatively low intensity. All right? So the oxygen availability is the key for aerobic metabolism. That's just that in complicated form. All right, so how much ATP do we end up with then? If I'm working with carbohydrate, not a lot is the answer, right? The good thing about carbohydrate is it's a relatively small molecule. It's right there in the bloodstream or in the muscle tissue anyway. And it's relatively quick to break it down and access the energy bond to make ATP. So if my blood glucose levels are stable, then I can take carbohydrate from the bloodstream, or if I've done a good job eating my carbohydrate the previous day, right? I have my baked potato, or I have my wholemeal bread, or I have my rice or my pasta. I did a good job of filling up my glycogen store. Then I've got glycogen sitting in the muscle that I can break down through glycolysis. Right? So that's good. I don't get very much carbohydrate, very much ATP from carbohydrate in glycolysis. But I can move the end product across and get some from aerobic metabolism, right? On the whole, though, we're looking at around, 32 to 33 molecules of ATP from a carbohydrate. So, better than a slap in the face, not very much energy. So, carbohydrate is really, really, really important. It doesn't yield a lot of ATP, but it also doesn't need very much oxygen, or any oxygen sometimes, in order to get at ATP. So it's really important that we maintain carbohydrate, right? If I have a long break between meals, so if I'm not snacking and I have, 4, 5, 6 hours between lunch and dinner, then, or when I'm exercising very hard, right, then my blood glucose levels start to drop. So we often hear people say, oh, my blood sugar's low, I feel a bit weak, or maybe lightheaded even, because your brain uses glucose. Right? Remember that we also have carbohydrates stored in the liver. So when my blood glucose levels drop down, I should have liver glycogen able to drip feed my bloodstream. Right? Works more efficiently for some people than other people. But I should be able to provide carbohydrate to my bloodstream from the liver. On the other hand, when blood glucose is really high, so I've just eaten a meal that had lots of good carbohydrate in it, right? Then my liver, my muscles are going to take that glucose and store it as glycogen. My brain is going to take that glucose and use it to function, right? Which is why you shouldn't come to class on an empty stomach, because if your blood glucose is low, your brain is going bloody, bloody. I see her lips moving, but I don't hear anything she's saying, blah, blah, right? Which doesn't help us learn. So if we want to learn, we have to make sure our blood glucose is relatively stable. Right? So our brain's got lots of carbohydrate. So during low intensity exercise, then I'm going to be using fats, and the carbohydrate that I would be using at that time would be primarily blood glucose, because it's easy to shift in and out. I'm not going to take the time to break down glycogen if I'm already breaking down fat as an energy source. If, however, I'm working a little bit harder, if I'm working at exercise we would identify as moderate intensity, then I'm going to start using blood glucose and stored glycogen from the muscle tissue. There are two other ways I can get glucose from carbohydrate. And your book talks about them and has a couple of diagrams on them. Again, they're things that I would tend to do with a graduate class at this university, not an undergraduate. Like if we had 3 ex-phys classes in that undergraduate program, you'd get these, but we don't. So, right, the Cori cycle is a way of taking lactate from the bloodstream and turning it back into glycogen at the liver. And then I can use it as an energy source. The other hypothesized way we can access carbohydrate is by shuttling the lactate to a tissue that needs energy, and it converts it into carbohydrate, right? So, when I was an undergrad, lactate was a big no-no. Right? It was a waste product, it wasn't useful, we couldn't do anything with it, we just had to get rid of it. Right? Now we've learned more, now we know that actually lactate can be recycled into a glucose and used for energy somewhere else in the body. So it's no longer considered a waste product, it's just a way of moving carbohydrate around to a different tissue in the body, all right? But I don't want you to spend time looking at the Cori cycle or the lactate shuttle, because we've got to get the regular, plain old systems down in this class. Okay, so 32 or 33 total ATPs if we're working aerobically from a carbohydrate? Not really very much. What about then what we see when we look at fats? Right? So when we look at fats, it's going to depend on how many carbon the free fatty acid portion of the triglyceride had. It could be anywhere up to 24. All right? They tend to be in even numbers of carbon molecules, so it could be 16, 18, 20, 22, 24. A lot more carbon than we had in the carbohydrate, which means I can produce much more acetyl-CoA when I break down the triglyceride. Once I've got it broken down to acetyl-CoA, the exact same thing happens as it did with the carbohydrate acetyl-CoA. Right? Because acetyl-CoA isn't a carb or a fat anymore. It's a molecule in its own right. So once I've broken it down to acetyl-CoA, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, just the same. It's just I see more of it because I get more acetyl-CoAs. Right? So the longer the fatty acid in the triglyceride, the more ATP production I can get from that one molecule of fat. So substantially more ATP production from a fat molecule than a carbohydrate molecule. The problem with the fat molecule is it takes forever to break it down because it's so flipping large. So if the fire alarm goes off and I say, okay, everybody get up and move outside quickly, fats can't help because I can't break them down that fast. Right? It's too big a molecule. I'm not anywhere close to getting at the energy stored in it. So carbohydrates are quicker and easier, but they don't provide as much energy as fats do. And we have a lot of fat stored. Remember our example where we were looking at someone who was 12% body fat or something, and we had 7,500 calories of fat. Right? There's always tons of calories stored in fat in someone's body, even someone who's super lean. So we're never going to run out. Now, what are the interactions? Also, we'll come back in a minute and we'll go back and looking at protein. But remember that typically we don't use protein as an energy source. Right? We use protein for mending things. We use protein for building things. We don't use it as an energy source. So when someone tells you you should eat more protein for energy, they don't know what they're talking about. Okay? You might want to point that out. That's not what we use it for. This little diagram initially looks a bit complicated, but actually I think it's a good visual because this diagram explains why extra calories lead to stored fat. Because another myth that you will come across is that I can't turn protein into fat, so I can eat as much protein as I like and I won't get fat. Because protein is protein, not fat. Right? Another little molecule of error that's floating around the universe. Right? Calorie is a calorie is a calorie. If you eat too many calories and you do not move enough to use those calories, they will get laid down as fat, right? And here's a very simple diagram explaining how that happens. All right, here's my stored fat. So I'm in an adipose cell. I have stored triglyceride. I've got the enzyme lipase available to break that triglyceride down into fatty acids and glycerol. And then I'm going to turn the fatty acids into acetyl-CoA, and I'm going to use it for aerobic metabolism to create ATP. Okay? So this is our typical path for aerobic metabolism. Right? The glycerol portion of the triglyceride can be broken down into glucose. So if I needed to, I could even use the glycerol portion indirectly to provide ATP. Because I can turn it into glucose and I can use the glucose in the normal way to make ATP. The interesting thing happens when we start reversing the picture. All right? I can break down protein. Here's my amino acids. Right? I can break down a protein into its amino acid building bricks. And I can, if I have to, make amino acids into acetyl-CoA and feed them into Krebs cycle. So I have the mechanism available to use protein for energy if I need to. It's just that usually we don't need to. Once I've got acetyl-CoA, my fatty acids can be broken down to acetyl-CoA, but acetyl-CoA can also be re-established as a fatty acid. Okay. The other thing I have to watch for is that amino acids can be broken down into a pyruvate. And pyruvate can then be fed into Krebs cycle, or it can be re-established as glucose and stored. If I have glucose and I've got extra glucose, I can turn it back to glycerol, and now I have my two things to add together to make triglyceride. So it doesn't matter whether I eat too much fat, or whether I eat too much protein, or whether I make too much carbohydrate. All of those molecules have a pathway to be laid down as stored fat if I don't utilize them within a short period of time. So this is one of the reasons why I tend to be a little bit negative about protein shakes and things like that, because people often use them as an extra drink rather than for what they're really useful for. Just because it's protein does not mean I cannot lay it down as fat if I have too many calories in my system. Right? Excess protein, excess carbs still lead to excess body fat. So what about these proteins then? Because there's a lot of controversy about proteins right now. There's a lot of I argue with my dad all the time because he's decided that he has a starvation day twice a week. He's on a there's some new fad diet that is 5-2. So you eat food for 5 days and you don't eat food for 2 days. Well, he's 80, so maybe he can get away without any food for 2 days, but I'm not thinking that's a very healthy way to go forwards, and so we argue about that a lot. There's a lot of discussion about, what impact does carbohydrate have on your body because you release insulin, and so that speeds up the laying down of fats. Well, not if you're exercising enough, because you would use the carbohydrate to fuel your exercise. So, lots of disagreement about diets and nutrition at the moment. So if I'm looking at amino acids that come from a protein, right, typically then metabolism of amino acids is going to be minimal. The circumstances where I'm likely to use amino acids for energy are if I am on an extreme diet, so my calorie intake is very, very low. Your body will leach calories from wherever it needs to. And it has a nice store of calories in your muscles. So if it has to, it will start to break down muscles to access protein and use it for energy. Okay? Remember I said the other day that they take information and they twist it a little bit. So they're not really lying, because if they lie, they can be in trouble. Right? They just don't quite tell the whole truth. If you eat a high protein diet, if you eat a high carbohydrate diet, if you eat a high fat diet, your body will over time adapt to use more of the substrate it is being provided with for energy. So if I eat lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of protein, eventually your body will use a little bit more protein than is typical as an energy source. Right? Will it use all the protein you eat? No. Will it use more protein than someone who isn't on a high protein diet? Yes. Right? But there's a ton of calories in protein. So you better be working your behind off if you're going to put that many calories in your body and expect to not put on weight. Right? Plus, we'll look at some of the dangerous side effects of high protein diets later in the semester. There's some really quite dramatic risks involved in a high protein diet. The third time when we do use some protein as an energy source is in a long-term endurance activity. So if I'm running a marathon or I'm doing one of those crazy 24-hour muscle man things, or a triathlon, right? Any of those kinds of really long, or I'm cycling the Tour de France, okay? Under those circumstances where you're going for a very, very long time, your body will use a specific enzyme that can break down proteins, facilitate breaking down proteins, and increase protein metabolism. But again, it's not a lot, right? A whole marathon, maybe 5% of the energy you need would come from protein. 95% of it came from carbohydrate and fat. So, in my view, it's inaccurate for companies to advertise that we use protein as an energy source. Okay. Can we? Yes, it's not a lie. Do we? Basically, no. If I'm on an extreme diet, we had another example last week where we were looking at men who had lost about 20 pounds in 12 weeks. And we had someone that dieted only, someone that dieted and did aerobic work, someone that dieted and did aerobic work and resistance weightlifting, right? And the person who did the aerobic and the weightlifting lost the most amount of their 20 pounds from their fat stores. Right? So what we know is when we're dieting, it's really important that we add in exercise to minimize muscle loss. Okay? Because if I'm not feeding the body enough calories, it will cheat and use some muscle. So I don't want it to do that because I want to keep my muscle and just lose fat. So it's really important that I maintain an exercise program or add an exercise program if I'm working with someone that doesn't do one. Okay. Add one in so that most of the weight loss comes from stored fat, not from other tissues where we don't want to take weight. extreme, but that's what happens when you start eating your own muscle mass. Okay? Alright, so on Friday then, we're going to look at the interactions. At what point do I stop using carbohydrate and start using fat and vice versa?